All right, here's the question. Is it a good time to go and check out new build communities for your first home? I'm going to lay out some pros and cons and talk a little bit about what's been going on so that you can decide. But I am at least intrigued for the first time in a long time. So, quick history lesson, because I used to be a history teacher. In the past 2 years, if you went to a new home community and said, I'd like to buy a house, they basically said you can get on our wait list. Our wait list is years long. You may not get a house. The prices could change. And it ended up where I didn't even show clients new build communities because there weren't opportunities. So fast forward to the interest rate hike that happened in June. There were people who had qualified when they initially went and found a home. And so they signed the contract, they worked with the builders, and that financing doesn't happen until basically the last 60 days. So in those last 60 days, the rates had jumped. All of a sudden, people didn't qualify anymore who had qualified earlier. So now builders have homes that they had buyers for, now they don't. Fast forward to today. A lot of those homes are now available, which builders didn't expect. Builders are starting to offer incentives to buyers. And so I went to a new home build community. The incentives change based on where you are. However, it was things like, we'll give you 4% of the cost of the home toward your closing costs, towards upgrades, towards lot premiums. The homes are, some of the homes, especially if you'll take one that is going to be finished by December, there are some really great incentives that happen because, again, those homes were supposed to have buyers and they were supposed to be taken, and now they're available. So it's kind of catching builders a little bit off guard. Another option with some of the money that they are kicking back, you can use that to decrease your rate, to get you into those rates that felt more comfortable. So that could be another option. And typically go through the builder's lender, they give you some pretty great deals. Okay, so what is now also happening in the new build communities is that, as of right now, there are less investors that are able to buy in those communities, but that could change. And so what I like about that is right now there's opportunity for buyers who are going to be owner occupants, but they're not competing against investors. So in the resale market, typically investors can free up plenty of cash to close on this house. And so instead, in new build communities, the homes aren't usually available to investors. So there's a little less competition. It kind of frees the path for people who really want a home and are going to live in it. So if they start selling to investors, that could all change. But right now, I haven't heard of as many communities that are willing to sell to investors. Okay, couple other things. Number one, the prices are generally set. Now, if you choose certain upgrades, your prices change. However, compared to the resale market, you're not putting in a bid. There is a set price and you are offering to pay that price. And there are pros and cons to that. We'll talk about it in a minute. The set pricing, I think, is really nice for people who know that they can't totally compete with people who have tons of cash to put down, to pay for any type of appraisal waiver that might be needed. But I think it gives people who are ready for home ownership a clear path. So I like the idea of living in that home for 2 to 5 years, starting to gain some equity, and then being able to sell that, use the equity towards your next step. Or stand forever if you love it. I mean, that works too. And now kind of like the biggie, at least for me, the lack of maintenance on a new house. Generally, there are no guarantees, but the thought that your your HVAC system is new, your foundation is new, your pipes are new. I've lived in a home that was like from the 50s. It needed lots of maintenance. We had to redo the sewer line. We had to redo the foundation. More on that later. The thought of having systems in the house that are new that potentially won't have issues for quite a while, and there's even going to be some systems that are covered by a warranty. What a benefit. And again, you have to decide if this is the right path for you, but I love the idea of not having big maintenance, especially as you're first starting out. Okay, let's talk about some of the potential less advantageous situations or some of the disadvantages of new home communities. Number one, where are new home communities being built? Generally, if they're close in, they're going to be very, very expensive. They tend to be farther out in more up and coming communities or communities that were rural and are now starting to have some growth. If you're okay with, you're kind of like betting on the location in the future. So if, right now that location feels far out. However, in time, that may not be quite as far out. I grew up in Chicago where the suburbs last for like 60 miles in every direction. So far out has a very different feel for me than for people who grew up in Texas. But, around Austin, 15 miles out is kind of the new close in. And so 20 miles out, 25 miles out, are those going to be areas where there's still going to be tremendous growth in the coming future? I could see it. So, anyway, so the new build communities tend to be a little farther out. If that's something that you're okay with, betting on that future of that community, it might be a go. Additionally, Austin is likely going to keep growing. And so, when we think about there's a community that feels farther out, Austin's job growth, the fact that businesses keep moving here, I think that Austin in 10 years is going to feel different than it does now. So betting on some of those farther out communities, really, it might be moot because there are so many people moving here that those communities, again, that's where people live now. Okay, let's get back to this idea of bidding on a house. Okay, in new build communities, there's not bidding. In this, that can work for you or against you. It could be a disadvantage because if you were going to go compete in the resale market, maybe you get a house at a $50,000 discount or a $20,000 discount because those sellers, we have to think about their motivation. Maybe they're not very motivated, and so we have an opportunity. No, maybe they are motivated and we have an opportunity to make an offer below asking and get a house at a great price. In the new build communities, there's no bidding. So while you don't have to compete and you don't have to worry about, not having enough cash to be able to pay for the overages in your bid, you also don't get to take a bunch off the price. And that can feel a little hard. And again, I think that's where those, the 4% back does help to equalize. But, if you're willing to compete, if you like competition, maybe that's the direction you go. And then last but not least, whenever I'm in a new build community, what my people sometimes say is, but it doesn't have trees. That's true. Generally, they are not going to have big trees. They are not going to have the big established oaks with the branches that fan out over the roofs and over the sidewalks and over the parks. They had to clear a lot of that to be able to build the houses. So you kind of get the baby trees, and it'll be great in 15 to 20 years. And they always say the best time to plant a tree is 10 years ago. If not that, then today. So that is kind of one of the drawbacks. I don't know that that's how everyone feels, but sometimes people are craving the shade. Okay, final thoughts. If a new build community might be an option, you got to consider community amenities. They tend to have more amenities than some of the older neighborhoods. Like if you're in central Austin, you kind of have a neighborhood, it might have sidewalks. That's my old neighborhood off of 45th Street. But, in some of the new build communities, they have pools and parks and walking trails, which I think a lot of the residents really like. In a lot of these communities, they do have HOAs that do some of the, maintenance of common areas. Some people love HOAs because they keep the community looking nice and crisp. Some people don't totally love them, but that's, I mean, that's a personal preference. But just be aware that that is something that you'll probably deal with if you are moving into a new build community. And then last but not least, I think that this whole idea of do I rent versus do I take on a mortgage? I have seen that rents seem to be rising across Austin, which I've reached out to some of my tenant clients, and they're like, I don't know, it's terrible worrying that my rent is going to go up. I fully agree. Mortgages are, have some, they have some stability built in, and so your mortgage payment, what that's going to be. Obviously, if you escrow your taxes and your taxes change, that is generally something that you can try to, budget for. However, the reality is that with a homestead exemption, it may not change as much as you would expect, and there's a cap to how much that can change. So it's a much more set cost. And again, I really hate for my tenant clients to really feel stuck that over time their rents could change and they just don't have as much control. So I do love the idea of people trying to get in and buy something if they can, because then you start gaining that equity and the appreciation. Austin has seen some pretty incredible appreciation over the past 2 years. And so for people who took the leap and bought something and were like, I don't know, they have been gaining. And so I love the idea that you can take that equity from your first home and use it towards getting into your second home or whatever comes next. I don't know, your boat, houseboat, or your downtown condo. I don't know, whatever seems like a fun next step. So if this is something that is of interest, I am happy to kind of do some digging for you and find you your next great space. This is Liz King signing off.